It's my honor this morning to introduce to you our two presenters. Morgan Dilks is our first presenter. Morgan is an attorney with Wright, Constable, and Skeen. And I find Morgan to be absolutely delightful and interesting. And one of the reasons I connected with him so quickly was he is a Maryland individual, but so he's been a business owner, and that experience as a small business owner. Morgan, it was a restaurant, right?
It was a coffee shop.
Coffee shop
company. So
yeah, you know, Morgan has walked the walk as well as talked the talk. So I am so excited to have met Morgan, to have connected with him, and thankfully Morgan also serves on our BBB Foundation board. So I always like to share something really interesting, and one of the things that's the most interesting of any of our presenters, Morgan's getting married this weekend. So I think that is phenomenal. And so huge round of applause, and we are his last activity before he launches on that path of thinking about nothing but the upcoming wedding. So Morgan, thank you for taking us on this morning, and we wish you so much luck.
Thank you.
Our second presenter this morning is also Debra Keller-Greene. Debra owns her own business, and she has been an HR professional for many, many years. She brings to us a wealth of expertise, and she will be jumping in and supporting Morgan as we go in this journey this morning on HR do's and don'ts from both the legal perspective and the practicality that Debra is so gifted in, and working directly with clients, small businesses, understanding what we go through each day. And I say we because we too are a small business. So Morgan, Debra, thank you so much for this morning. And Morgan, I believe we're going to turn it over to you to kick it off.
Perfect. Just wait for the slideshow to pop up. All right. Well, welcome everybody. As Angie said, good morning, and this is the BBB's presentation of the do's and don'ts of hiring from an HR and legal perspective, presented by myself, Morgan Dilks, and Debra Keller-Greene. Next slide, please. So a little bit about myself. My name is Morgan Dilks. I'm a general practice attorney who happens to do a lot with labor and employment in my practice. Prior to becoming an attorney, I received my master's in business administration from Mount St. Mary's University, where I also went to undergraduate and played a little bit of rugby. I spent a few years in financial management prior to becoming a business owner. I was an accountant. I worked for Erickson Retirement Communities in financial management. And as we discussed, I also owned a coffee shop and a catering company. So my experiences are very broad. I've done just about everything except be an astronaut, but there's still time. Next slide, please. So we're going to discuss a couple of topics today from the hiring perspective. First, we're going to talk about the importance of clarity on the position itself. Next, we're going to discuss some things about the do's and don'ts of the interview itself. After that, we'll touch briefly on the interviewers. Then we'll move on to discussing the candidate, and then just a bit of an overview on the process itself. Then I'm going to use a recent story from my career to illustrate one of the points that I'm going to make about understanding employment laws and the ways that the laws affect your hiring process. And I guess just as a little bit of a bonus, I'm going to throw in a little brief discussion on some things that are starting to feel unique about 2020 and 2021, but will probably be with us for the foreseeable future. Next slide, please. So spring tends to be a major hiring season for a lot of companies. Many companies tend to hire in January and February. This is the time of the year when companies tend to roll out updated budgets and sales forecasts, and they have a better idea of the staffing needs for the upcoming year. However, there's still a lot of jobs being filled in April and May. New graduates are just receiving their diplomas, And people have vacations planned, so they'd like to fill those roles and possibly get a little bit of training done prior to going on vacation. You know, June, July, August, everybody's busy, people are going to the beach. So, you know, you'd like to try to wrap some of that up and fill those roles. So really, there's no time like the present to brush up on the do's and don'ts of hiring. Next slide. So first and foremost, you want to be clear about the position you're looking to fill. You're going to want to prepare a written job description, job title that is indicative of the work that's going to be done. And you're going to want to ask the prospective supervisor to ensure the duties and responsibilities are current. Make sure to list software programs the candidates will need to know, certifications or degrees required, and skills the applicant must have. The description should include anticipated work schedule, work location, and physical requirements to communicate to potential candidates before they even apply for the position. Reasoning for the clarity and transparency can be critical for an employer's protection. We attorneys have a saying, you plan for the marriage, we plan for the divorce. What that means is that an employer or entrepreneur's job is to go out there and think big, you know, expect and plan for the best out of everyone. But, you know, our job is to protect the employer in the event that things don't go as planned. So employment attorneys tend to prepare for the worst case scenario. So should a situation arise when things aren't working out with an employee and you seek to terminate them and you've given them a job description that doesn't match the job they're actually doing, or you've left details out of the description when hiring, it's possible they could perceive that you're terminating them for a reason other than just a bad fit. Next slide. So next, you'll want to prepare a set of questions to ask the candidate. Use this set of questions when interviewing all of the candidates. Some experienced interviewers may prefer an unstructured format, you know, giving the candidate some latitude to lead the interview. In an unstructured format, questions tend to be open-ended, allowing the candidate's personality to shine through compared to closed-ended questions, which elicit brief answers, yes, no questions. While unstructured interviews tend to work well with experienced interviewers, always be sure to refer back to the prepared set of questions. This way, each interview ends with the interviewer obtaining the information needed to prepare to make the hiring decision. When all applicants are asked the same questions, it's easier to defend against allegations of discrimination in the hiring and the selection. And to that point, interviews are important for identifying a qualified candidate, but it's also necessary to build your paper trail. If you choose one candidate over another and the candidate who didn't get the job feels like they may have been discriminated against, it can be critical for a company to be able to point to concrete reasons why they chose one candidate over another. And remember to steer clear of the off-limits questions. Job applicants actually have legal rights prior to becoming an employee. Under federal law, an employer cannot illegally discriminate in its hiring process based on an applicant's race, national origin, gender, pregnancy, age, disability, or religion. Steer clear of any questions that inquire about whether an applicant has or intends to have children, an applicant's marital status or race or religion or sexual preference or age, other than inquiring whether they're over the age of 18 years, or whether an applicant suffers from a disability. You have to avoid all of those questions. And these questions, they can take many forms. You don't have to ask a candidate if they have children if you ask them what time they pick their children up from school. Any question or any form of question that would lead to information that's otherwise protected must be avoided at all costs. And this extends not just to the candidate itself, but also to the references. A good kind of thing to keep in mind for that is if you can't ask the candidate the question, then you can't try to get the information out of the reference. It's just information that you're not allowed to consider, so it's really best to not even have it. Next slide, please. So now let's talk about the interviewers for a second. Delegation of the interviewing process to someone who has no human resources training can be problematic. All interviewers should be familiar with federal, state, and local employment laws pertaining to employment interviews. An inexperienced interviewer can easily get caught up in what they think is a friendly conversation, but instead create liability for their employer, particularly if the candidate's not selected for the job. It's also helpful to have multiple interviewers present, even if only one's leading. This can be helpful in protecting the facts of the conversation, should a dispute arise as to what was discussed throughout the interview. Next slide, please. So one thing that comes up from time to time, really a little bit more often than time to time in my business, is restrictive covenants. And restrictive covenants also are known as non-competes. If your company's considering hiring someone from a competitor, make sure there are no contractual restrictions between the candidate and their current or former employers. Last thing any new employer wants is to find itself on the right side of the V, or the wrong side of the V, in a lawsuit because it knows or should have known better about a candidate's non-competition agreement. Always ask the candidate if they're currently subjected to any restricted covenant agreements that would preclude them from accepting a job with your company. If the candidate answers yes, or if they're not certain, request a copy of the agreement to review for yourself or to run by your attorney. Overlooking this important step in the interview process can invite unexpected legal action, and I should also say can be costly. Next slide, please. So taking notes, while there are various schools of thought about note-taking during interviews, it's important to document feedback about each candidate. You never want to write anything about a candidate's race or other physical characteristics that can become plaintiff's exhibits in a discrimination complaint. Those who interview regularly jot down notes on a separate sheet of paper during the interview and then prepare a written summary to compare one candidate to the other, or to remember something that stood out about a certain candidate's experience that's relevant to your company. And that goes back to building the paper trail as well. You know, it's always good if you can identify and clearly articulate the reasons why you chose one candidate over another. And note-taking can help that. You just want to be careful about what you write down. Next slide, please. So the job posting. In preparing the job posting, wording can be critically important. You want to ensure that you're welcoming a broad range of candidates from various walks of life by not showing a preference for any of the listed criteria. Clearly, no reasonable employer is going to say they're looking for a candidate of a certain age range. However, the bias can be manifested through just, the type of wording that you use. For example, you don't want to say in the posting, seeking a young, energetic team player. Both the words young and energetic suggest an age preference that could land you in hot water if you snub an older candidate. Better wording for that sort of thing might be hardworking team player. But and as you can see on the slide here, we've got a list of things that, just like in the interview itself, questions that you can ask. These are things that you want to avoid putting into or even hinting at in a job description. And it helps to kind of bounce the job description off of a couple of other people, certainly the hiring manager, certainly the prospective supervisor, as we've discussed, to try to make sure that the description's accurate for the job that you're hiring, but also to make sure that there isn't anything that could be construed in some sort of way as showing some sort of preference. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the offer and the pay for a second. The offer itself should be based on the skills and responsibilities required for the job without taking into account any of the protected factors such as sex, race, religion, or any other factor that we've described previously. And that includes age. Experience manifests itself in many forms. And just like everything in the hiring process, you want to be able to articulate why you made certain decisions that you made. The pay also must conform to the appropriate classification of jobs. Now, there are two types of classifications. There are exempt employees and there are non-exempt employees. Exempt means that you do not have to pay hourly or overtime wages. To be exempt, you have to fall into one of the following categories. There are administrative employees, and that's those whose primary duty is the performance of office or non-manual work directly related to the management or general business operations of the employer or the employer's customers. This is distinguished from work on a manufacturing line or selling a product in a retail or service environment. There are executive employees, and those are employees whose primary duty is managing the business, and they manage at least 2 employees or a unit of the employee's business, the employer's business. There are professional employees, and that's those whose primary duty is the performance of work requiring advanced skill and knowledge in a field of science or learning and customarily acquired by a course of specialized intellectual instruction. This work must be predominantly intellectual in character and includes work requiring the consistent exercise of discretion and judgment. There are computer professionals, and computer professionals are also exempt employees. They're individuals employed as computer systems analysts, programmers, software engineers, or other similarly skilled work in the computer field. And finally, there are outside sales employees. Those are employees whose primary job duties involve making sales or obtaining orders from employers or for the employer's goods or services, or who are customarily and regularly engaged away from the employer's place of business. Outside sales employees are not required to be compensated on a salary basis, but they can be. So they can be exempt or non-exempt. And all other classifications are non-exempt, and you can get into trouble by paying, for example, a manual labor employee a salary. So let me jump into a real world example. Next slide, please. Let me put the exempt versus non-exempt issue into just a recent issue that I dealt with. Let's say we have an employer, and I'm going to make up the facts of this because just to protect the innocent. Let's say we have an employer who's seeking to fill a custodial role. The employer puts out a job posting, gets an interested applicant, meets with the applicant. The interview goes well, and the employer offers the job to the applicant, but requires that they be a salaried employee and not be paid overtime. The newly hired employee quickly finds out that he's working on average 60 hours a week, but the employer's not paying him overtime because the employee agreed to work as a salaried employee. Does this create a problem? And the answer to that is a resounding yes. Custodial positions do not fit into the exempt categories that we discussed on the previous slide. The employer could end up facing a lot of financial exposure as a result of the failure to pay overtime. In Maryland, if an employee has to sue his or her employer for unpaid but earned wages, the employer could be on the hook for up to 3 times the amount owed. Under federal Fair Labor Standards claim, the employer could be liable for double damages. So the question that I've gotten in relation to this before is, what about the employee's agreement to work as a salaried employee? And the answer to that is the employee cannot agree to work for a salary if they do not fit into the exempt categories as we've discussed. And the reason for that is a public policy issue. If the law permitted employees to waive their rights to overtime, then just about every employer out there would make waiver of overtime a condition of employment. And the legislature's determined that's not in the best interest of the general public. Bottom line here is that not knowing the laws that govern your business can get you into a lot of trouble. Next slide, please. So before I turn this over to Debra, I want to talk a little bit about the interesting things that have arisen in 2020 and 2021. And I originally had this slide titled Unique Issues in 2020 and 2021. But the truth is that what I'm about to talk about is likely here to stay. We've all seen the world change around us in the past year. There's a lot of teleworking. A lot of people are going to remain teleworking. And some of these things that have crept up on us have been good. And, they've been beneficial to our business and to our society, but they certainly bring, new and unique legal challenges and at least things that you want to be aware of. So, with so many interviews taking place on video platforms like Zoom, employers, HR professionals, and hiring managers, we need to be aware of some potential risks that may not have been previously considered when all interviews were taking place, or at least the vast majority of interviews were taking place face to face. So employers are likely aware that requirements in certain states to ensure that prospective employees know they're being recorded. Maryland's what's called a two-party consent state, meaning that you need consent from both parties to record a conversation. So generally, advising someone that a conversation is being recorded satisfies that requirement, as Angie did earlier this morning. As continuing the conversation after being advised can be considered implied consent. There are certainly important considerations that you should you choose to record the interview. What would happen if an employer asked an inappropriate question? There's now evidence that can not only be used against the employer, but can also be shared online. This can damage the reputation of the employer while also leading claims against them. So if you're considering recording your Zoom interview, you just have to understand the risks that go along with it. To minimize the risk, here are some things that you might want to consider. Number one, have candidates sign a non-disclosure agreement before they join the interview. Number two, ask the candidates to sign an agreement stating they won't record and or publish the interview anywhere. And that's if you are choosing not to record the interview. You're just having the interview, but you can record these interviews on both sides. So you can have a potential employee, or I guess a candidate, agree not to record the interview. Number three, you certainly want to train the interviewers on appropriate interviewing tactics and questions, and ensure that they either stick to a script or a well-defined framework. And number four, make sure the interviewers have gone through discrimination training to ensure a fair and compliant interview process. Now, there are also security and privacy risks that go along with this. And as for those, in the hiring process, employers seek and share confidential information with prospective employees all the time, whether that's in the interview or after the interview when documents are being transferred and signed and confidential information is being transmitted, such as social security numbers, for example. We have to fill out I-9s and W-4s, and that if you're hiring remotely, all of that is suddenly not filled out in the human resources office like it would have been years ago. So with all of those things in place, there's certainly a bigger cybersecurity risk. So there are a few ways to protect against the potential problems there. Number one, you want to conduct the interview in secure video or phone conferencing application. Remote hiring doesn't have to be on Zoom. There are certainly other secure apps out there that can be used. Number two, you're going to want to instruct the candidate to join the video conference from a private network. It would be a little unusual, I think, to have a job interview in a busy coffee shop, but certainly not for some industries. There are some industries out there where that's probably perfectly normal. But either way, the candidate probably shouldn't be joining the Wi-Fi network at Starbucks when there are 30 other people around. And number three, using the secure digital signature applications for any job offers or any employment contracts. And finally, additional thing to consider is the disparate impact. The very nature of interviewing presents some risks, of virtual interviewing, because of the technology required to make these interactions possible. Not all potential candidates have equal access to technology, which could give rise to disparate impact claims if too many people of a certain class are not getting jobs despite their qualifications, just because they don't have really great Wi-Fi or access to the internet or computers. Having multiple ways to conduct an interview can alleviate this burden on employers. Besides, the best candidate to fill the position, they may not have the great internet access. That doesn't make them any less qualified or any less great of a candidate, and you would really hate to overlook a potentially outstanding candidate for your role just because of something as simple as an internet issue. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn this over to Debra Keller-Greene now. She's the CEO of Keller Professional Services. She's going to discuss some interviewing tips with everybody, and she's going to start by introducing herself and telling herself a little bit about her. Telling you guys a little bit about herself.
Thank you, Morgan. That has been great information, and I appreciate being a student, even as a consultant, and so it's always good to stay current and have the benefit of information, and especially when it relates to providing the best service to your clients. So again, I'm Debra Keller-Greene. I am a small business owner, a human resource and small business consultant, and I specialize in staffing and job placement. So I have staffing and job placement expertise. And my formal training, in terms of academic training, I have received my bachelor's degree in business administration with a focus on organizational behavior from the then was Notre Dame, the Wheaton College of Notre Dame. Now it's called Notre Dame University, Notre Dame of Maryland University. So I'm a graduate of Notre Dame of Maryland University. And as a HR consultant and a small business consultant, I assist my clients with recruitment and their staffing needs. And so I will be speaking about the do's and don'ts of interviewing from a recruitment perspective. Next slide, please. And so what I will provide are some examples of, or some tips, some interviewing tips. And I want to start by first saying that I agree with everything that Morgan said, because I don't want to get into trouble. So I'm just going to confess that I agree with everything that Morgan said previously. But seriously speaking, the first point that Morgan made is the importance of the job description. And the job description is absolutely essential to the recruitment process, and interviewing definitely is an essential element of recruitment. So that job description is going to reflect that job posting, which provides all of the key information that is required for describing the job, and that clarity of the position. And so in terms of the job description, it also provides a source for developing that well-structured, your well-structured interview questions, and to ensure those consistency and legal requirements and compliance requirements. So the job description is vital. And the other important thing that I will reiterate is that the interview is a structured process that ensures consistency and legal compliance. So, so part of the structured process is that paper trail that Morgan talked about. And basically, Morgan mentioned taking notes and summarizing your notes after the interview. So I recommend creating a candidate profile template, in which you can document key factors such as the outstanding characteristics that stand out from each candidate. So having, I feel that the candidate profile is actually a way that you can, structure your documentation, just by using a template to make those notes less cumbersome as you talk from one candidate to the next, and distinguish what some of those outstanding characteristics are, and to keep that compliance factor in place as well, so that that document reflects why you chose one candidate over another. So in addition to being knowledgeable of compliance laws, to be effective as an interviewer, the interviewer must also be adept in identifying key information from the candidate's resume to incorporate in the interview. So yes, you do want to prepare and have structured questions that you ask every candidate. But it's also important to be able to identify information from that resume to incorporate in your interviews, just to ensure that you are verifying, or that you are receiving information that's going to contribute to a quality hire. So this ensures that you capture and verify unique qualities and skill sets relevant to the position. And this is your opportunity to ask for examples on how the candidate has used his or her experience on previous jobs. So I would just add that factor. Morgan also emphasized the importance of being a skilled interviewer, or if you're seeking a skilled interviewer, to make sure that there's a skilled interviewer who is aware of federal and state laws, and who is also adept at identifying and qualifying candidates, and who can assist you in getting the most qualified candidate without getting you in trouble. My take is that a skilled interviewer is one who can achieve a good balance between a structured and an unstructured interview. And that's with a combination of open-ended and closed-ended questions. And I will give you some examples later. But all candidates, I agree that all candidates should be asked the same questions based on the requirements of the position, plus any specific questions regarding information from the candidate's resume. Just as it is important to structure the interview questions to ensure that they meet legal requirements, it is important that the interview questions help the interviewer evaluate the quality of that hire. So what do I mean? Interview questions should seek the application of job relevant skills, positive interactions with coworkers and managers, maybe their problem solving abilities, their level of productivity. All of those things should be, all of those things will help you to determine the quality of your hire. And so it is important to be able to, for your interview questions, to be able to obtain that information. I just want to leave with a couple of examples, and I want to test drive them to make sure that they are compliant. So Morgan, are you ready? So
I didn't know I was being tested here, but let's do it.
I'm testing my, I'm testing my compliance. So I'm going to share some of my some examples of interview questions, and I want to know if they pass the compliance test. Just want to make sure they do. That's all.
Okay.
All right. So I want to give you a couple of examples of interview questions that I ask and what I hope to learn about candidates from their answers. I want to be mindful to steer clear of asking any off-limit questions. So I usually ask the question, tell me about yourself. Okay. And what I hope to learn about the candidate is any outstanding qualities. I want to be able to, identify any outstanding qualities by asking this question. And also anything that the interviewee wishes to share that will help me to evaluate a quality hire. Now, Morgan, sometimes the candidate will provide information that is off limits for the interviewer to ask. So if that interviewee volunteers that information, does that become a compliance issue? How are we able to, how would you treat that situation?
So I guess for the interviewer to be non-compliant with the Fair Labor Standards Act and the Civil Rights Act and the ADEA, and really, anything that they could run afoul of during the interview, for the interviewer to run afoul of that, they would actually have to ask the question. That being said, if a candidate in the tell me a little bit about yourself starts going down a path that you as the interviewer know is problematic under, again, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, you should cut them off. Because ultimately you can't unhear what you heard, but you can stop them from saying anything else, because truthfully, you don't want to have that information. And that's kind of an interesting question, because it probably does come up more often than you'd think. The best practice there is to just cut them off and say, well, hold on a second. There's some certain things that we don't want to know about, that we can't know about throughout this interview process. Let's, and then steer the question a little bit away from, what are your interests? What are your pastimes? Tell me a little bit about your education, those kinds of, more innocuous questions. So tell me about yourself in and of itself is an absolutely fine question to ask during an interview, and probably something that everybody should ask during an interview. It gives the candidate the leeway to, give a free form answer. It lets you evaluate the candidate from that perspective and say, oh, how do they think on their feet? What,
Yes.
are you prepared for, a question like this? But yeah, if you start going down the path of, well, I've been disabled since, wait, hold on a second. Let's avoid that sort of thing. So that's really the best way to handle that.
All right. Well, I'm glad I asked the question, because it's for all of those reasons, because it does happen often, but that question does provide, it is a good evaluator of the candidate. So that's a good technique. So you have to come up with a technique to redirect.
Absolutely. And it really is, it's for the employer's protection as well, because the truth is, if this person is just a terrible candidate in general, but then they give you some information that you're not supposed to have, you never know. They may come back and allege that they didn't get the job because they're pregnant, or because they have a disability, or something like that. And it's not information that you ever asked. So really, you didn't do anything wrong, but it not protect you from having an EEOC charge filed against you. The best way to protect yourself is to cut it off and not have the information in the first place.
All right. Well, thank you, Morgan. Another
great question, by the way. Great.
Okay. Thank you. My second example of an interview question is to give me an example of how you used XYZ software doing a previous job. That, again, an open-ended question that will allow you to evaluate the quality hire. And when I say quality hire, what I'm referring to is the relevant job related skills and experience, and how well that person can explain or can demonstrate his knowledge in that particular area, and whether or not in distinguishing between candidates, if one candidate has experience with software that we're using, or that the employer is using, or if that candidate can speak to various types of software that they use, and even make recommendations, and just pretty much showing their knowledge in terms of software. So that is, give me an example of, you can fill in a blank on that one, and obtain information that about job related relevance. Okay, and so the third example is that I will always end the interview by asking, do you have any questions? And this provides the interviewee with the opportunity to ask questions not covered in the interview, or something that he may have that may have come to his mind and did not have an opportunity to ask during the interview. And this also allows you to properly end the interview with a thank you. So that's all I have.